Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Mohammed Yusri, Digital Development Manager at Attaqa. I'm based in Cairo, Egypt. Now, I will turn the microphone to our amazing moderator, Sohaib Abbas. Hello, Sohaib.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us, guys, today. We have got a couple of interesting topics to go over today. To quickly just go over a couple of the points that we're going to go over. Today's discussion is going to be the weaponization of energy. All right, oil and gas, along with the effects of climate change. We're gonna touch base. Some of the questions we're going to go over is the oil weapon, the gas weapon. How has that evolved over a period of time, and what traditionally versus modern periods of time, along with natural gas and climate change policies that are being instituted that are preventing us to be able to recuperate in terms of having enough capability that can ensure the stability, the energy stability globally. So what we're going to do is we're going to wait a couple minutes. We're slated to start in about 2 minutes here. We're going to give it a 2 more minutes, and then we're going to start off. Quickly, I'm just going to summarize here. This is about our third spaces so far. It's been a sequel. We've done a good job in terms of recording them at 30 days, and then the recording erases. So we're going to have it on YouTube, and that's going to be included once it's posted. And then what we're going to do this time around is we're going to have a hard stop, 2 hours, and then questions for 30 minutes. And then the question, sometimes we notice that they tend to be long winded. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a more proactive role this time around. So it's 30 seconds. If you can just focus on just to concentrate your ideas in as little words as possible, because we're going to have a lot of people that are going to be interested in asking questions today, especially as the topics discussed in the room becomes more and more prevalent and more serious, especially as we go into the summertime here, peak driving season, and things are looking really, really strained as we are. So we'll give it 30 more seconds here. I'll just if I can ask a quick favor here, the content and the quality that we're going to be sharing in the room is really, really unique. Some of the highest caliber that you'll come across. And the only thing we ask in return here is for you to be able to share this material. There's a lots of Twitter's a noisy place. It's like a fire hydrant. You're just shooting information is just shooting a million miles a second. And part of curating the content and getting it out to the right people includes your participation. So if you could just do us a favor, the only thing we ask in return is if you could retweet the link, comment, and just help us put it out there, so that way we can get to as much people that are interested in participating and asking questions on the stage. Ultimately, these events, these spaces, they're only as strong as your individual contribution. We're outsourcing and carpooling information globally. This topic of energy is it's a political topic, and requires participation from everyone globally, everyone to add their own little insights to augment Dr. Anes's perspectives. So without further ado, it's 2:01 here. We're slated to start our program. I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Anes for some quick opening comments. And before I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to encourage individuals. I'm going to post a quick link up in the room here. This is a charity that Dr. Anes is involved with. And the only thing I personally, with some of the other rooms or some of the really charitable members of the room, the only thing I see as a way of paying them back is participating in their charities. So the only that's something I would encourage. So I'm going to post it up in a link. And without further ado, I'll present Dr. Anas Alhajj. Thank you for joining us here today. If you can start it off with opening statements, and then we'll proceed with the question format. Dr. Anas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sohaib, and thank you, Muhammad. Today we are going to talk about a topic that is rarely discussed, although I'm going to focus on it from a historical perspective. It is relative to today's events, and it is relative to the future. So if you are an investor or a trader in the energy world, this is relevant to you in every sense. At the same time, it gives you a perspective about various issues that we are seeing today, as I discuss some of the historical events and the lessons that we learned from them. As Sohaib mentioned, I would like to urge you to retweet the link to the space so more people can benefit. At the same time, all of us are trying to do our part in terms of charity work, and I would like to encourage you to donate to this charity. For those who followed me on Twitter, just imagine the happiness you create when you have a little child who never seen his mother or parents, and then with $100 operation, that child can see for the first time his or her mother. So even little amounts matter. So I encourage you to do so. Sohaib?
Wonderful. Okay, so what we're going to do here, folks, we're going to proceed with the first question of the room here. This is, we talk about actual weapons. We talk about weapons being fired around the world, ammunition being stacked into the place where there's current conflict, and then we hear a weapon. That's what we think. We think ammunition. But in the title of the room, you said oil weapon, and we're just trying to get a better understanding as how those two relate. And you also say gas weapon. Are we talking about, the chemical weapons? Or what exactly are we talking about? If you can add a little clarity to those points. Thank you, Dr. Anas.
Sure. The phrase oil weapon almost universally uh, calls to mind the October oil embargo of 1973. When we talk about oil weapon, it comes in several formats, and I'm going to talk about all of them today. But generally speaking, for those who are familiar with the oil history, the moment you mention oil weapon, people think about the October oil embargo of 1973. And I will explain later why I called it the October oil embargo of 1973, and I did not call it the Arab embargo. Various countries have used oil as a political weapon in recent history. The use of oil as a political weapon was and remains very common, and we see it today. And I'm going to explain to you how we see it today in various ways. And the U.S. has used the oil weapon more than any other country in the world. To answer your question directly, in the literature, the phrase oil weapon refers to the imposition of oil embargoes to coerce the targeted country to change its stand on a certain issue. So we get to focus on this point because this is kind of the main thrust of the whole thing here. The original idea of imposing an embargo on a country, whether oil or anything else, is to force that country to change its attitude to match what the imposer want. And we already know that those embargoes fail, and I will explain later why they fail. So the main idea here is these embargoes are imposed to coerce the targeted country to change its stand on a certain issue. For the gas weapon, it's the same idea. The only reason why we did not hear about the gas weapon until recently is that the oil market has been global for a very long time. The gas market is not global yet. However, with the expansion of Russian gas pipelines to Europe, multiple pipelines, multiple direction, and to China, uh, uh, and the dependence of Europe on natural gas imports, especially from Russia, made the political impact a concern, not only in Europe, but even in the United States. In fact, the concern of the United States of Europe dependence on Russia is bigger than Europe concern of dependence on Russia. Right now, the natural gas market is moving toward being a global market, but not there yet. And how that? With LNG. LNG expansion is making the gas market move toward globalization. Whether this happen or not, we will see what will happen in the next few years. The gas weapon refers to the imposition of embargoes on natural gas importers or exporters. The same idea with oil in this case, to coerce the targeted country to change its stand on a certain issue. For example, restricting imports from Russia to force Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. That's a gas weapon. Or Russia restricting exports to Europe, that's gas exports to Europe, to force Europe not to punish Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. So that's what the oil weapon and the gas weapon are. So, hey.
So now that we got a better understanding of those implications and how that takes place, if we can proceed with understanding has this weapons used, what is the impact on the global environment when it's used, and how damaging can it possibly be?
Yes, the thing here is this oil weapon evolved historically, and the traditional one is literally the like the 1973 oil embargo. That's called the traditional oil weapon. But the oil weapon evolved, and because it evolved, we can distinguish between the traditional oil weapon and the modern oil weapon. Of course, we cannot use it for gas because gas is something relatively new anyway, but the concept still applies anyway once we understand the differences between them. Oil as a traditional weapon refers to the use of oil embargoes by governments, and emphasize the word government. Just underline the word government here, because it's really one of the major differences are related to this. So the traditional oil weapon refers to the use of oil embargoes by governments to achieve political goals. Oil as a modern weapon refers to the use of explosives, and that's what you alluded to in the beginning. Refers to the use of explosives and other weapons by political oppositions, insurgents, terrorists, and all the others. Everyone who is not satisfied with something, they just go and blow up pipelines. We've seen this all around the world. So it's been used by insurgents, terrorists, and sometimes even other governments, whether Secret Service or others, to destroy all facilities, to cut outputs, to cut exports, and to achieve political goals. And of course, it's not necessarily even to be cutting output and exports, as we are going to see later. It's really sometimes the big bang, it's the big fire, it's the big smoke that everyone sees from miles, where media can take pictures of that and videos and spread it around the world. So the traditional oil weapon refers to sanctions by governments, while the modern oil weapon refers to attacks on oil facilities by mostly unknown groups. So the concept of oil weapon has evolved from embargoes to the modern type, and this we've seen this in Iraq during the invasion and during the war. We've seen it in Yemen. We've seen it in Sudan. We've seen it in Colombia. The Lyman pipeline used to be bombed like every 2 days for a very long time. And one of the reasons, and we've discussed this when we talk about the 1973 embargo and the previous embargo, one of the reasons for it is the failure of the traditional oil embargo themselves, because they did not achieve any targets and people got frustrated. Of course, one of the reasons for expanding the concept of the oil weapon is the increase of the number of players, especially who are not part of the oil industry or the governments involved. Because we've seen this around the world, where people who have nothing to do with the oil industry and they are not part of the government, just attacking the oil facilities and curtailing output or exports. One of the reasons, of course, is globalization and advancement of technology. Globalization made the modern oil weapon basically more successful, and the advancement of technology made the oil weapon extremely successful, including the use of drones, for example. Made anyone, even with little money and little technology, achieve big results out out of this. And with globalization and global media, of course, they were able to achieve some of their objectives. From a historical point of view, the use of oil as a weapon in warfare preceded its use in oil embargoes. Oil has been known for a long time, for thousands of years. And flame balls, basically, or that's oil soaked wool balls or cotton balls or cloth, were used in wars as fireballs long time ago. In fact, even during the Abbasid Empire, when they have a whole section in the military where they use the catapult to throw these fires, and they won several wars, and they attacked. They were able to destroy the some walls or whatever protecting the cities at that time using those fires. So they were part of the armies historically. The Allies in World War II, for example, bombed oil tankers and oil facilities. They consider them, as you know, strategic, legitimate targets. We've seen the Japanese kamikaze attacks on the Allies' oil tankers and facilities. One of the ironies of the kamikaze attacks is that the pilots who did the attacks have no fuel to go back. So that was the only way, basically, to finish attacking the targets. In some cases, the Allies bombed their own facilities in anticipation of a retreat. We've seen this where they want to prevent Japan or Germany from not benefiting from these fields. We've seen the Romanian oil fields basically being destroyed and the wells being filled with every scrap metal they can get in this case. Again, from a historical point of view, when people look at the embargoes, while several experts discount any recurrence of an oil embargo by oil producers, the oil weapon has evolved no matter what, as armed political opposition, insurgents, terrorists, as I mentioned, restrict oil supplies. And the irony is more effectively in most cases than the traditional oil weapon, more effectively than governments that want to impose oil embargoes. They can influence markets as the news travel instantly. That's part of the globalization that I mentioned. And they can raise oil prices. They can really affect markets based on whatever damage they can do to these facilities. So, looking at the history, it is clear that the oil weapon has entered a new phase several years ago. Oil facilities have become the prime target for all those insurgents and terrorist opposition groups in various countries. Attacks have increased substantially in recent decades. Globalization, of course, made it more common. It did increase the number of targets. Globalization makes it more effective and more harmful, simply because your market now as an oil producer is way larger than before. And the realization by all parties involved in a conflict that whoever controls the oil flow in an oil producing country controls its destiny. And of course, in some cases, like if you look at what the Houthis doing in Saudi Arabia, although they are hitting right now soft targets, in the past they did hit some very important targets. But one of the ideas here that we should pay attention to, and it's related to today's events in Russia and Ukraine, is that one of the objectives of the Houthis basically is to show the world that Saudi Arabia is not a reliable producer, is not a reliable exporter. So there is another objective here. Luckily for the Saudis, They have the spare capacity and the redundancy that we've seen in 2019 to defeat that purpose. Again, we are still talking about this from a historical perspective. The United States has historically imposed a greater number of oil embargoes than any other nation. Before World War II, the US and the Netherlands imposed an oil embargo on Japan. In the early 60s, the US and Western Europe imposed restrictions on oil imports from the Soviet Union. They prohibited, for example, exporting steel pipes for fear that the Soviets could cut off oil supplies for political reasons, etc. Later, the US and the Allies, sometimes in coordination with the United Nations, imposed oil embargoes on several countries, including South Africa, for those who remember the apartheid, on Serbia during the disintegration of the Yugoslav Republic, and Haiti. Haiti, by the way, this is very important here. For those who attended the Iran presentation, you might recall that I mentioned that the only time the superpowers were able to hold Iranian crude was in 1951 after the nationalization of oil, when the British Navy blocked any shipments out of Iran out of the Hormuz Strait. So they literally used the Navy. So an embargo is successful only when military is used. And Haiti here is very important because the embargo on Haiti was successful because it was surrounded by the U.S. Navy. The U.S. And its allies also imposed embargoes on oil imports from Libya, Iran, Iraq, Sudan, Syria, Burma. At one point, and I think this was during the Clinton years or the Bush years, I forgot. One of them, basically, I think it was Clinton. They contemplated imposing oil embargo on imports from Nigeria. But when we talk about oil as a traditional weapon, and here, what this segment, although it's a historical segment that I want to talk about, it has tremendous implications for what's going on right now when we talk about embargo on Russia and the Russian reaction to this, whether Russia is going to impose its own restrictions on exports of oil and gas. So the details here are really relevant. Traditionally, when we talk about the traditional oil weapon, a number of Arab oil-producing states used oil as a political weapon against Western countries in 3 instances: one in 1956, one in 1967, and one in 1973. I'm going to be brief describing those events, but when you look at the details are amazing, and the lessons out of them to today's world are too many. But one of the ironies when we talk about the Arab oil producing countries that impose embargoes on the Western allies in 1956, 1967, and 1973 is that all the leaders and those countries are allies of the West. You would think revolutionaries like in Iraq or Egypt or Syria basically will lead that charge. That was not the case. So there is a lesson to be learned here. So the leaders of these embargo efforts were U.S. allies. That includes Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Their declared objective was supposedly to force countries that supported Israel, especially the U.S., to change their political stand and put pressure on Israel to withdraw from territories it occupied during the 1967 war. So again, here we are talking about trying to coerce a country to achieve political goals, and the goal was clear. The tool was oil, but why? The question is why it failed in 1956, why it failed in 1967, why it was successful in 1973. As I mentioned, there are many lessons there. When we talk about other countries, Iraq and Iran called on Islamic states to halt oil exports. We heard this several times, and I think once we heard the Malaysian Prime Minister talking about it, to use oil as a weapon to force Israel to pull out of Palestinian areas after the incursion into Jenin refugee camp in March of 2002. Even after that, we've seen Muslim leaders calling on the use of oil weapon for the same purpose. So I'm going to go over those three embargoes quickly, just to get some lessons out of them. In 1956, we had an oil embargo. So what happened at that time? When Mossadegh was successful in nationalizing the oil industry in Iran in 1951, that was a spark for all the nationalists in the Arab world to do something. So Jamal Abdel Nasser basically nationalized the Suez Canal because he was inspired by several factors, of course, and one of them is the success of Mossadegh in nationalizing the oil industry in 1951. So Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in the early summer of 1956. The canal was owned by Westerners, mostly England and France. And they retaliated. So England, France, and Israel retaliated by launching a war against Egypt. That's what if you review that and you want to read about it, it's called the Suez Crisis. Saudi Arabia signed a security pact with the Egyptian government in 1955. So a year earlier, they have that security pact signed between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So because of that pact, and when Egypt was attacked by those three countries, Saudi Arabia basically was a very small, primitive country at that time. So it did not have even an army the way we know it today. So they cannot really send an army to Egypt to defend the canal. So one way to stand by them is to impose an oil embargo on all exports to Britain and France. But that was the first oil embargo, and there were several mistakes in it. And the lessons out of that are very important, because they did impose restrictions on exports to those countries, but they did not restrict production. They did not cut production. So shipments, once they are in the sea, they can go anywhere. That's the same problem with Iran. Iran nationalization failed simply because Iran did not own any tankers. That's why the current regime in Iran learned the lesson, and that's why they own their own tankers to market their own oil right now. That's what the Saudis learned too. That's why they own their own tankers right now. They have Bahri, which is one of the biggest and largest in the world, and they have those super tankers. So they learned the lesson from the mistakes that happened in 1951 and 1956, that the embargo failed. One of the reasons for the failure is that they cannot control destinations. They couldn't control shipments. They have no ships to ship. And of course, oil and reserves at that time were owned by the four partners of Aramco. They are the American oil companies. So Saudi Arabia did not control the reserves and production at that time. However, prices did increase anyway at that time, but for another reason, because a Syrian nationalist group blew up one of the pumping stations of the Iraqi Petroleum Company, that a pipeline that goes through Syria, and this constituted an actual cut in exports. So the embargo failed, but because of that explosion, we were talking about the non-traditional oil weapon. Basically, you can see that it is really old. This is from 1956, where a group bombed a pipeline. In 1967, it was the embargo was a reaction to the West's support of Israel in the 1967 war. There was a rumor at that time that three countries, that Britain, the US, and Germany, provided air cover for the Israeli Air Force to bomb all the military bases, all the military or the Air Force bases in Egypt. That was a rumor. It was discovered it was a rumor. But the justification for the embargo was the idea that they provided a cover. So it started on June 4th, 1967. It ended quickly at the end of August after they found out that that was a rumor. And It failed to achieve its political objectives. Israel did not change its stand. The three countries, United States, UK, and Germany, did not change their stand toward Israel. And one of the reasons for the failure is that there was a spare capacity, and the United States was able to compensate Europe for any of those losses. So there is another lesson here, that you need spare capacity, and you need a country willing to use it and transfer shipments. So there are lessons here to be learned from those. Then we have the 1973 oil embargo, which is again, when we say oil weapon, most likely people will remember this. It was imposed officially, it was imposed from October 19, 1973 to March 17, 1974. So it lasted only for a few months. It is imposed by several Arab countries. I said several, I did not say the Arab countries. It was imposed on the US and the Netherlands. Again, there was a war, which is the Arab-Israeli war, raging at that time. However, oil prices quadrupled and did not revert to their pre-embargo level after the end of the embargo. So this embargo was different from the previous two embargoes, and the question is why? And because of this, at least what we see in the Western literature, world economic growth declined. Most Western economies and Eastern economies, so we're talking about Korea and Japan too, suffered from a recession, inflation, and unemployment. For those who followed me for a long time, you've seen my research on this. I said the Western narrative is not fully correct. The embargo was used as a cover to all the policy failures, whether economic or foreign or energy policies, especially in the United States. So looking at those three embargoes, or those three weapons, the three embargoes failed to achieve their political objectives. So although prices increased substantially, but Israel still exists, and the support to Israel from those countries that are being targeted is stronger than ever. So they did not achieve their objective. Embargoes always fail in achieving their objectives. Then why countries impose them? They impose them for their symbolic value. The politicians have to do something. And why the other countries are not bothered by it despite the pain? Because embargoes invoke nationalism in the targeted countries, and therefore the level of pain they handle is way higher than before. And therefore they can handle the pain. Embargoes are always painful, and they are painful to both sides, not only one side. So looking back at those embargoes, the embargoes of 1956 and 1967 have not affected world oil markets for several reasons, including the lack of production cut. So that's a lesson. And the existence of large spare capacity at that time, and that's another lesson. And the willingness of the United States in particular to use that spare capacity and redirect shipments, that's the third lesson. For the 1973 embargo, several factors coalesced and contributed to the fourfold increase in oil prices after the imposition of the 1973 embargo. Of course, there were production cuts, so that was a lesson learned from the previous ones. But for those who are interested, you can search my name and embargo in Twitter, and you will see a long thread showing that the energy crisis existed in the United States 2-3 years before the embargo, And most of the pictures you see, most of those photos of gasoline lines in the 70s, they say, well, this is because of the Arab embargo. Most of them are absolutely, absolutely not correct. Those pictures, those lines existed way before the embargo. And you can see the dates. I already put the dates for those pictures. You can see the sources and the actual references to show that gasoline lines existed way before the embargo of 1973. Most of the pictures that are being repeated today in the media are not from the embargo. Simply, the energy crisis in the United States started in 1970 and gotten worse and worse and worse. And it just happened that the embargo happened, and the Nixon administration used it as a cover for the failure of all other policies. Here, I would like to kind of elaborate more on this. If these embargoes are imposed again to achieve the stated political objectives, they failed. So embargoes always fail to change the attitude of the other country or the targeted country. If they are imposed for their symbolic value, they succeeded. However, for the 1973 embargo, one of the main issues here is that the Saudi government rejected imposing the embargo for months, even before the war started. And there was a lot of pressure from the Arab street and from countries like Iraq and Syria and Egypt, and they refused. And for some reason, at the last moment, they changed their mind. And there are several theories here to explain that. I'll try to avoid explaining them here, but the whole issue here is pay attention to the narratives. Each group has its own narrative, and those most of those narratives are completely incorrect. The Again, we are talking about the traditional the traditional weapon here, or the oil weapon, and the symbolic value works only in the short run. Once certain groups do not see tangible benefits from the symbolism, they take matters into their hands, and that give value, or that give or advance the modern type of oil weapon. So in a sense, they are connected. And therefore, I want you to understand here and read between the lines of what I'm saying here, that the if the if the embargo by an oil producer does not achieve its objectives and it is symbolic, then think about what the symbolism is to prevent the modern oil weapon from being used. So in this case, what are the similarities between the traditional oil weapon and the modern oil weapon? The first one is both traditional and modern oil weapons are used to curb supplies and exports. Both are used to pressure the target to change its stand on an issue or issues, and mostly political. And both pose a threat to world oil supplies and increase oil prices and increase volatility. So I know this was a very long answer, Sohaib, but I hope I covered a lot of ground answering the question.
You certainly have, and Dr. Anas, just because we talked about the past, and you talked about how the issues started to happening in the 1970s, and then by the 1973 they were given an opportunity to blame. So placing that relative to the current circumstances that's taken place, where we acknowledge globally, and this is sort of like a sub question before we proceed to the next question, where we identified that we're on track to running into supply production issues. Now we ended up with a current conflict. Like, what similarities can we draw between what took place in the 1970s and attributing blame towards the Arab oil embargo relative to what's currently taking place in Russia, Ukraine, where you feel like we're on a similar state or a similar situation and attributing blame towards towards
Yes,
yeah.
in one way, basically, people are have been predicting that Russia will punish Europe by cutting supplies, whether oil or gas. That's one similarity. It is similar in a sense that a large producer is trying to influence the political decision of a targeted consumer. The other similarities, basically, both happened during periods of high prices and economic turmoil. Both happened during periods uh, where the world was not in cohesion. So, in a sense, there were several issues that are political, social, and economic when we talk about the similarities.
So it seems that the similarities to draw is during periods of high energy prices, incentivizes individuals or incentivizes parties to be able to take advantage and allow themselves to
Yes, and one of
yeah.
the issues, of course, let me elaborate a little bit on this. That spare capacity was very low. Spare capacity is low right now. That's number one. Shipping capacity was limited. The refining capacity was limited. We have multiple problems in several producing countries. That was the case in 1973 too. At that time, we had people who were predicting prices to go to $100. Now we have people predicting oil prices to go to $200. So there were other similarities. Among the similarities that we have hoarding. At that time, we have ships basically full of oil being transferred. The ownership of those ships basically being changed several times a day. That's another factor. We've seen speculation. So there are many similarities between that time and now.
Got it. So we're going to proceed with another here question in regards. We talked about the oil, and now I think we're going to talk about the natural gas and the role that the shale revolution has played into has previously played and won't necessarily play moving forward.
If you don't mind, I will. Before I answer this question, I just want to talk about the differences between the traditional oil weapon and the modern oil weapon, because it has several lessons we learned from the attacks on Saudi Arabia and the attacks on the oil tankers in Fujairah and others. So among those differences that historically, when we talk about the traditional oil weapon, when we talk about embargoes, the number of players is very small. Now, with the modern oil weapon, the number of players is very large. Political tension in any oil producing countries basically trigger the use of the oil weapon and attacks on facilities. And it is no longer between two defined, well known entities. Before we know, it's Saudi Arabia, UK, Saudi Arabia, United States. Here, in many cases, we even don't know, like the attacks on Iraq or the attacks on Fujairah. Well, I mean, we can guess, but we don't have clear entities in this case. The second difference is the identity of the players. The political tension that triggers the modern oil weapon involves several known and unknown groups. In the traditional one, we have always known groups. A third difference are the goals. The producing country used the traditional oil weapon to achieve a well-defined goals. The Arabs basically were, or those countries that imposed the 1973 embargo, they said we want Israel to go back to the 1967 border and apply the UN Resolution 242, and we want the U.S. to stop supporting Israel. That was very specific. Most political groups right now that use the modern oil weapon do not have defined and clear objectives. In many cases, the objective is to inflict pain on the enemy anywhere, anyhow, anytime. And whether it was on civilian or non-civilians, etc., They just do it mostly because they want to please their supporters, or they want to recruit more people. In this case, among the differences is the cooperation. In the three embargoes, 1956, 67, 1973, we saw cooperation among various Arab countries to achieve a unified goal. On the other side, we've seen consumers basically working together and helping each other. But current groups using the modern oil weapon to achieve various and even contradictory objectives without any coordination. This is like kind of the leaderless revolution or leaderless groups. So that's another problem that increases volatility and increases the unknowns in the future of the oil industry. Among the differences, and I think this is a very important point to understand what the Houthis and others are doing: cost. Uh, Unlike the traditional oil weapon, the modern oil weapon increases the cost of oil production, while the cost of doing so is very minimal and small. The cost of repair, rebuilding, etc. While the embargo basically does not destroy capacity, the embargo does not destroy facilities, and of course you have to pay for security, etc., etc. And that includes, of course, ships to protect the shipping lanes and others. Why the cost to the to those who are doing this is very small. Anyone with small drone, little explosives, little money can cause that damage. Another difference is the effect. Countries that use the traditional oil weapon might be able to distinguish between friends and foes and adopt various policies to reduce the effect on friends. Look what the Russians are doing today. They are, and probably you heard it on one of the calm spaces first from me when I talked about Russia will divide the world into friendly, non-friendly, and neutral. If you recall that several months ago, the idea here is those countries can distinguish between countries and direct shipments right now to that and make sure that friends are getting enough oil or gas, just like what Putin is planning on doing. But the modern oil weapon does not distinguish between friends and foes. They all suffer the same consequences. And the result: higher volatility, lower supplies, higher oil prices. And the conclusion for this, especially when it comes to the Houthis and attacks on Saudi Arabia, the Houthis are looking for the target that give them the big bang. Like last time, they attacked a storage facility. It has no impact on Aramco, has no impact on supplies, have no impact on the oil market. But the market panicked simply because those videos being transmitted throughout the world, and people did not know even where the location is. They were looking for the big bang. It was the smoke. It was the fire. Doing so, they are behaving like a group, not as a state. Therefore, the international community should deal with it as a group and not as a state. Now, to go back to your question about gas, the gas weapon, as I mentioned, we had no traditional gas weapon because the most natural gas markets were local. Then Russia started expanding pipelines, etc., and then became regional. And then with LNG, it became more global, but it's not global yet. So, as I mentioned earlier, the gas weapon refers to the imposition of embargoes, and that's the traditional use. Embargoes on natural gas importers or exporters, or in this case, it affects imports or exports, to coerce the targeted country, whether an importer or exporter, to change its stand on certain issue. So, in this case, what we are seeing is the modern oil weapon applies to gas too. So we have a modern gas weapon where facilities basically could be attacked. For example, if the pipelines in some of the countries, that Russian gas pipelines are attacked by certain groups, and they are unknown groups or certain intelligence groups. We don't know to which country they belong. They just do it. So as Europe became more dependent on Russia for natural gas, Russia gained political influence in Europe. That is considered a threat, especially from the US point of view. But it was the US shale revolution that encouraged the US to go after Russian gas right now in Europe. It was the LNG, US LNG, that enabled the US to go after Russian gas in Europe. The political impact of the US shale revolution, whether oil or gas, is huge. Trump would not have imposed sanctions on or reimposed the sanctions on Iran if it wasn't for the shale revolution. He would not have imposed the sanctions on Venezuela if it wasn't for the shale revolution. Now, Russia might use the gas as a weapon by restricting exports to Europe if Russia is cornered. Sohaib?
And just to build up on that question here now, we understand for some individuals that understand the implications of U.S. shale right now in the direction it's headed. So, in regards to the stance moving forward, what do you see in terms of America imposing sanctions on other countries? So, just that brief counter question, and then we'll proceed with the next point.
Sure.
Back to program.
The fact is, many politicians think that we are energy independent. And therefore, we don't care about others, and we don't need the Saudi oil, and we don't need to protect the Hormuz Strait, and we don't want to send our armies around the world, etc. And we've seen this. If you just Google it, you will see many articles and many comments on this, and many interviews talking about this. So it gives many politicians the false sense of security, and therefore they were able to do what they did. But if you go back and analyze this within a different time frame, you can see the danger of such a policy. And one of the main problems that's been overlooked by Trump administration and all of those who are calling for not importing oil from anywhere else and not protecting the Hormuz Strait or the other waterways, etc., they don't understand the crude quality issues that we always talk about. Crude quality matters. U.S. shale is light sweet. U.S. shale produces a lot of condensates, while U.S. refiners are importing between 6 to 7 million barrels a day of medium to heavy crude and mostly sour crude. Why? Because they were built to handle that type of crude. So when they talk about the shale revolution, they shoot themselves in the foot because they focus on quantity and they ignore quality. Sohaib?
Okay, and then just another quick follow-up is what does it take? What do you think is going to take to break this false sense of security that the shale revolution has created for the political governing class?
This is exactly what we are doing in those podcasts and Twitter spaces is education, education, education. Because the more information we provide to people, the more they talk to their other people and they talk to their representatives until they get the message that to be secure, we need energy interdependence. Energy dependence is a fake idea that is harmful. Now, we can talk about energy interdependence regionally. For example, we had projects in the 90s about energy interdependence in the Americas. But here we are talking about a large number of countries in both North America and South America. That's theoretically doable. But again, when you look at energy security and you look at the principles of energy security, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, we realize that probably the energy market should be integrated bigger than the Americas.
Now, the next question here is going to talk about the climate change policies, since that seems to fit in within within, like it gets weaponized. But before we do that, do you see? And I think a great segue to this question would be, within the next 12 months or maybe even 8 months, do you see any price shocks taking place as a result of any of the modern weapons, or modern versus historical weapons that we've been referring to so far?
Well, the first one is the possibility of Putin, if he is cornered, to use the oil weapon or the gas weapon in a traditional sense, is plausible. Again, if he is cornered, but he does not have to. He has cronies in several countries, including in Syria and other places, where they can use the modern or type of weapon. He still have contacts with Iran. They still have contacts with the Houthis, etc. So his cronies basically can do certain things without resorting to the traditional weapon. So in a sense, the modern weapon, with the advancement of technology, can do the job of the traditional oil weapon.
Wow, that's very remarkable here. And I think it's demonstrated in the recent attacks we've been seeing in regards to that. So let's discuss the next point. It's just the weaponization of climate change policies, anti hydrocarbon climate change policies. I mean, for the individuals in the room that I see you here, you've got into multiple back and forth with individuals that carry the sentiment where it's better left in the ground, and we understand the implications that will have on us moving forward. Dr. Anas, I'll pass it
Sure.
off to you in order to discuss
Yes.
this.
Just before I start, I just would like to point out a point that I missed. When we talk about the advancement of technology and the oil weapon and the modern oil weapon, the modern gas weapon, the modern energy weapon, and because this is a work in process I've been working on for the last 20 years or so, and this is still work in process. We are going to evolve to the energy weapon, and I will explain this in a few minutes. But the idea here is cyber attacks is included in the modern oil weapon or the modern gas weapon. So don't forget cyber attacks. Anyway, to answer your question on climate change, weaponizing climate change comes in several ways. It comes in just like when oil used itself as a weapon by soaking wool or cotton balls and throwing it at the enemy, or used in battlefield. The same way we have eco terrorists basically attacking facilities, etc., sometimes burning them or just boarding them and stopping production, etc. So that's one form of weaponizing climate change. This media attacks, constant media attacks on the oil industry, that's really a form of weapon too, because it is affecting the reputation of banks and companies and financiers, etc. And that's why we see now banks are worried and others are worried about their reputation. We've seen funds, including nonprofit organizations, basically bailing out of the industry simply because of reputation. Why? Because of the media attacks. So that's another form of weaponizing climate change. And then there is we started seeing this, and I hope it will not go behind this. But I am really pessimistic here, and I think this is going to get uglier and uglier every day. Government policies. We are seeing governments basically inserting climate change in everything, and therefore climate change policies are going to affect direction of trade, direction of finance, which countries to be financed and which countries are not, which projects to be financed and which not. They are affecting the financing of world organizations, and which one is going to be dwindled, and which one is going to dwindle, and which one is going to be expanded. We might end up with sanctions on countries because they are not abiding by climate change rules. So we will see whether this is going to happen in the next few years or not. We will. I am afraid that we will end up with a global system. If you want to talk about a new world order, in this case, a new world order where countries are classified based on their climate change progress, instead of, for example, human rights abuses or terrorism, which is scary because the number of countries you can put under terrorism or human rights abuses is limited. When you talk about climate change, it's a blanket for the whole world. And it could be used as a counter weapon to the especially traditional oil weapon, but it is bigger, more powerful, and cover more countries. And looking at it from kind of a counter weapon, this is very interesting, because if you really think about it from a game theory point of view, I produce oil or gas. I might cut exports to you if you don't do what I want, and then you are going to use the climate policies against me. That's going to lead to some sort of negotiations, and that will be very interesting to see. So while it is a counter weapon in this case, it has its own problems, and these are serious problems. Changing dependence, and please pay attention to this, because all we are doing here is changing dependence from oil and gas. So we don't want to be dependent on oil and gas, but we are going to be dependent on lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, and rare earth metals. So we are just changing, in a sense, just dependence from one source, from one natural resource to another with climate change policies. Sohaib?
Yeah, and I think to add to that also is, I think nothing was more stark than highlighting the hierarchy of the human race, and what I mean by that is you weaponize using these climate change policies to institute anti production policies, and then once you realize that you're in a shortfall, having the LNG tankers detour from and break contractual agreements with certain countries in order for other countries to benefit, and the same countries that campaigned towards limiting their own production. Would you be able to speak, because you talked about first world, a new world order in terms of segregating the haves and the have-nots. Could you talk about the implications this is going to have on the less impoverished, less well-off members in society, or less well-off
Yes,
countries?
basically 2 points here. The first point is we already have seen GM refusing to commit to a plant in Mexico because they thought that plant and the city does not abide by climate change rules. So we already have seen the climate change issues being implemented in real life. To go back directly to your question, what we are seeing here is, and we've seen this since the energy crisis started in last May. What we see is only those who can afford the high energy prices will get the energy source, while the poor cannot. So if we have limited LNG supplies and limited gas supplies, and China can afford that, well, China will get them, and then other poor countries will not be able to get them, and that makes the situation even worse for those countries. So, hey.
And then the next thing we're going to proceed with is talking about the effects, just the lithium weapon, since that's being a little more prevalent. If you can expand a little more on that, because the places of lithium and some of these other metals are a little bit different to when where you would typically find deposits of oil. So I think that would change also the makeup as we focus more on the metals versus the hydrocarbons.
Absolutely. And everything I said today about oil and gas, just take the word oil and replace it with lithium or cobalt, and you end up with the same story. But let me use this to kind of wrap up the whole thing and make a conclusion. Today, we've already been there for 1 hour, so I want to wrap it up and answer your question at the same time. Historically, we had the oil and gas weapons. By weaponizing climate change, we weaponize more countries and more resources. So imagine this. We have more countries and more resources. That means volatility is going to go through the roof of everything. So we are We have more sources because we have lithium, cobalt, and nickel, and rare earth metals, and graphite, etc. And that means our lives and economies will become more volatile than ever. If Europe, China, and India behave rationally when it comes to energy sources and their imports, and they worry about their energy security. So there's a big F here. They will diversify sources of imports. That means by default, diversification of exports by producers, which is good for everyone. Producers have diversified consumer base, and consumers have a diversified producer base. So that's good for the world, good for security, and takes politics out of the picture, or at least it reduces the role of politics in it when you have this type of diversification. The problem is climate change policies are violating all principles of energy security. Concentration on certain resources on one hand, and those resources are coming from are concentrated geographically in few countries. That's a violation of the principles of energy security. And what's funny is all of this while processing decentralized or processing the materials needed for the green economy is so concentrated that only one country does that, China. So most of the processing of those minerals basically happens in China. So you have two segments to it. You have where the geographic location of those resources, and you have the processing of this. So you have a serious problem, and that's violation of energy security. While it is easy to solve the energy security issues related to oil and gas, simply all you got to do just diversify, it is extremely difficult to solve problems related to minerals needed for the green economy. The result is limitation of growth of green energy. It's limitation of growth in electric vehicles. I'm not denying that they are going to grow. They are going to grow, but there will be limitations simply because of the issues I mentioned. That by default means higher demand for oil and higher demand for gas than all expectations. And to conclude and wrap up the whole thing here, at least on my part here, whoever controls the oil and gas flow in an oil or gas producing country controls its destiny. The second conclusion is that the oil weapon has evolved. It is more dangerous, more effective than ever. It is unpredictable, and some of its results may have long-term consequences. Just imagine with the September 2019 attack on Saudi Aramco, if Aramco did not have this redundancy at that time, we would not be able even today to compensate for 5.5 million barrels a day. But it was the redundancy of Aramco at that time that helped us overcome this problem. So the consequences of such attacks are really severe if they hit in a sense in the right place from their point of view. We know that the oil weapon is more effective, especially in increasing prices when excess capacity is small or non-existent. The other conclusion is that it is almost impossible to eliminate the threat of the modern weapon. The best way to mitigate its effect is to build large spare capacity, and notice this, around the world. Around the world. Concentrated excess capacity may not solve the problem. In fact, it may make the situation worse. Other policies might help. For example, if we have some sort of flexible international strategic petroleum reserve system, I'm not going to delve into to the details of this, but it is doable and possible where producers and consumers basically participate in that. And another conclusion is that with climate change policies, volatility will increase in several sectors. Everything that applies to oil and gas in terms of traditional and modern weapons will apply to lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, rare earth, etc. So that answers your question directly here. We have the same problem. And if climate change is weaponized and policies are implemented to dictate direction of trade and, of course, finance through whatever rules they can, including sanctions, our world will be different from today. How, and that back to your point about the poor countries versus rich countries, how countries that are suffering from weaponizing climate change will react. It seems that those poor countries, they will reach a time when they do something, whatever that thing, we don't know. But there is a fear here that with weaponizing climate change and the suffering of the poorer countries around the world, we might see political chaos and the whole world will pay the price for it. Suhaib, I'm done with the main talk today. If you want to open the floor for questions and answers.
Yeah, I guess from the things that you sent to me to discuss, just one last point I think we might have missed, and then we'll wrap it up and open the floor for the questions. And that is the future of energy markets as resources becomes weapons of choice.
Yes, this is where this issue of volatility comes in, and with this volatility, we will end up with massive additional cost of everything, and this is going to be a shock for the profits of green energy. Here, I would like to point out, and I'm when I say this, I'm not saying this. I'm saying this sincerely, and this is the result of my research that we do need all energy sources. We do need renewable energy. We need solar. We need wind. We need all the technologies. We need all the energy efficiency technologies. We need diversification in the transportation sector. We need electric vehicles. But we need to do that with common sense. We need to balance environmental security with economic security, with energy security in this case. But profits of a green economy always promised us that the cost will continue to go down. With the views I just mentioned, with this volatility, with the use of with politicizing and weaponizing climate change, we might end up with higher costs of everything, and that cost could be an increasing cost. So the idea that the cost will continue to decline may not be correct in this case. So that's another limitation for the green energy. And every time we talk about limitations, it means by default higher demand for oil and gas. That's not being counted for. And that's where the problem is. If we are not counting this demand, then we'll get shocked in the future. And that's why we are going to end up with energy crisis that we never seen before. The final point here, I would like to remind listeners of what we mentioned before regarding this idea that higher cost of oil and gas by default means higher cost of renewable energy and electric vehicles. Evidence abound. Sohaib.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to open up the floor to questions. So for individuals looking to ask questions, if you can start putting your hands up, and I could start lining you guys up on the queue there to start asking questions. Meanwhile, while we wait for everybody to place in their requests to share in their questions with us, I'm going to start off the Q&A session with a question of my own here till we get the place rolling. And this is there seems to be entitlement from the West in regards to the producers' spare capacity. And we just finished talking about how it's important it is to have this spare capacity, and it's in order to be able to curb and assuage the shocks that may take place in the future. So this entitlement towards the spare capacity of these producers, how detrimental can it possibly be if these countries are pressured to give up their spare capacity in order to lower prices when that's not their purpose, as you eloquently highlighted? So that's the first question, and then we'll get other guys up here. Thank you,
Well,
Dr.
generally speaking, when we talk about spare capacity, we have to remember that really when we talk about all these spare issues. We are talking about commercial stocks, we are talking about strategic petroleum stocks, and we are talking about spare capacity, because they complement each other, and at certain limit there is a substitution between them too. So the issue here is, people raised the issue of spare capacity. I would like to mention one point here for the sake of time, and I want to kind of talk in details about it. As some OPEC members with spare capacity increase production, their spare capacity will decline. As they compensate for Russian oil, their spare capacity will decline. But please remember that Russian spare capacity is increasing. Again, the difference between the traditional weapon and the modern weapon is that the modern weapon is destructive. It destroys spare capacity. It destroys capacity. While the traditional weapon, just imposing embargoes, does not destroy capacity. And therefore, if Russian oil companies are not able to export because of banks, because of insurance, because of restrictions, that capacity is still there. And therefore, their spare capacity goes up.
So we have some hands up here. I see Cameron came up first, so let's get Cameron a chance, and then we'll go over to #oil and agnostic. Go ahead, Cameron.
Yeah, first, just really appreciate the insight. I always learn a great deal from these. So thank you to you and to your guests.
Thank you.
First, just a brief comment, and then second, a question. The first is sort of the premise of what has been discussed here is that if there is continued pressure on fossil fuels and the petrol industry, that poor countries will suffer more than rich countries. Well, that may be true in some respects, but the rich countries, and I'm thinking specifically of the Europeans, but also of the United States, we've done a great deal to erode our domestic capacity. Certainly in the United States and in Europe, as we know, they're to some extent at the beck and call of the Russians, because countries like Germany, Italy, and others have virtually no domestic energy in terms of fossil fuels anymore. So in that sense, I think the richer Western countries are actually far more vulnerable. To my question, what kind of countermeasures, with every force there's an equal and opposite reaction, what kind of countermeasures can other countries take if the West persists in imposing its regime of climate control and so forth and so on? So an example of what I'm saying is the Russians shut off the natural gas supply to Germany, or Saudi Arabia decides to trade petroleum in a different fiat other than the dollar.
Yes, thank you. This is a very important question. The issue here is that if we are not going to achieve any of the climate change objectives unless Europe and the United States in particular adopt a policy where they can balance energy security with economic security with environmental security. Otherwise, they will just keep shifting from extreme to extreme. And probably that's what's going to happen in reality for the next decades. But on the other side, because of the hype that we seen from the media about climate change, and before that about shale, we've seen that oil-producing countries trying to change their policies, because they depend heavily on oil supplies, on oil revenues, and they see that there will be less revenues, or probably no revenues in a few decades. So what they want to do is they want to make their oil more usable so they can guarantee revenues. And their idea is very simple. I am going to export oil to you embedded in something else. And we are going to convert that oil or gas to materials. And if you want to convert completely to electric vehicles, please do. We want to make sure that the whole body of each electric vehicle is made from our oil and gas. The same thing apply for wind turbine blades, to solar and cement, etc. All these things. So if those countries are going to continue with their policies as you assumed, we are going to see a reaction from those countries. In fact, there is a theory right now. It's not, there is not enough evidence on it, but um, uh, it is clear that Putin, without intending to, he already delayed European green policies for several years by bringing them back to natural gas, by bringing them back to coal, by some countries like Sweden bringing them back to even oil. So he already delayed that without even intending to do so. But now we learned the lesson. Will that becomes a policy? So
Hashtag oil. You are second up. Go ahead. Hashtag oil. The floor is yours.
Thank you for that, Sohaib. And Dr. Anas, thank you so much. And Attaqa for another generous afternoon here for all of us here in North America. I would like to just ask you a question, actually, that transition to what you were just saying with respect to Putin and the unintended or intended, if you will, consequences of his invasion of Ukraine and what that's done to delay the green movement. What would how would you respond to a question that asks you to sort of, guesstimate what impact energy policy would have if you start to see more right-wing governments come into power? I mean, you're seeing a closer race right now in France. We're all obviously hoping that, Joe Biden, ends up falling asleep in a bathtub and Trudeau, gets eaten by a shark. But, if these regimes were to change, because obviously they're all in bed with one another, how would you sort of forecast the change in energy policies within the respective countries?
This is a very important question, and on several fronts. I have not done the numbers yet to play the scenario. But one thing is very clear. It's going to be the swing of a pendulum in this case. Just like what we've seen with Trump and Biden, that we are going to go from one extreme to another extreme. And therefore, the main result is we just need more oil and gas, because that green energy is not going to grow the same way they are forecasting. Imagine if Trump comes back in 2025. And what's going to happen to all those green policies that have been adopted? Even 10 days ago, he was talking about wind power, making fun of it. So we are going to see a swing of a pendulum in this case, just from one side to one side. And the main result of that is be prepared, because if we don't have enough investment in oil and gas, the demand for both is going to continue the same way it was like a decade ago. So, hey.
We're going to go over to Agnostic. Go ahead. And other fellas in the room that are interested in asking questions, please do request to come up. And once you're up, if you could raise your hand up so we can get an idea of what the queue will look like. Agnostic, floor is yours.
Okay, Sohaib, Anis, again, like everybody's saying, thank you for these. I learn more and learn where I'm wrong more often here than I do anyplace else, and it's much appreciated. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Anis, one of the things that you were mentioning is the weaponization of things like climate control and financial instruments, insurance, all the rest of that. You and I should probably have a talk offline about some of this stuff that's been going on for over 20 years in the process of weaponizing financing for oil and gas. I know that in Somalia, there were several efforts that were basically halted by the State Department on an ongoing basis around the world. It wasn't just the United States that did it, but at the United States' behest, it was done in various areas around the world to sit down and halt any work in Somalia. The Chinese took over, stuffed the wells up. Finally, the Somalis kicked out the Chinese, South Sudan. Sorry about that. They kicked out the Chinese, and their productivity on their wells is now minimized because of the long-term lack of maintenance by the Chinese on the wells in that area. So and this is to support your idea of, the reserves get declined, but the reserves get declined over an extended time period, and this has been going on for many, many, many years now. Certain elements are kept off grid. They can't come in because they can't get financing. But those that are operational, that get taken over and operated, just whether they're operated properly or not, the reserve capacity of those declines constantly because of lack of maintenance, lack of financing, and lack of servicing. And like I said, this has been going on for 20, 25 years. And the process of doing that, I think, has now been well ensconced within multi-levels of governmental operations around the world for sitting down and doing it, which surprises me immensely, the degree to which it's actually embedded in there. Your thesis, I think, is not only supported in the current environment, but I think if you look back, and I don't know if you have looked back in your 30 years, it's supported historically to a huge degree. And I applaud your analysis. I think it's very accurate. The variability, the swings in the whole process are just extreme. And it's not even Biden versus Trump. It's basically U.S. embedded government policy and worldwide policy versus Greens versus other things that just create these huge swings that don't allow any process of intermediation between each other to bring
Gnostic,
something sensible.
yeah, that's good for now.
Thank you.
And that's
Yes, thank you very much. I'll be happy to talk to you, and let's talk offline. This is. I know this. Whatever we covered today was a little bit heavy, given that the audience background varies and it's global. So I have to keep it. I don't want to go into depth, but whatever points you mentioned was covered in the research. In fact, on one of the spaces, I think the space on Iran I talked about South Sudan and what the Christian right, when they weaponized what the Christian right did to force talisman out of Sudan. So you are absolutely correct, and there are many pieces of evidence from around the world to show that. So it's been politicized and weaponized long ago. And thank you, and I'll be happy to talk to you.
Wonderful. We're going to proceed with Eleni, and then right after Eleni, we'll go to John and proceed with Beth. For anyone else in the room, for any of the other individuals that are on the stage, please do put your hands up so I can, have something to follow in terms of the line. Go ahead, Eleni, and then John.
Hi, Dr. Anas. Earlier you spoke to crude quality and sort of the demand from the refiners. We've been seeing, some heavy crude shortages, and people have been saying that that's been leading to the middle distillate shortages, like jet fuel and diesel. My question is sort of on the refining situation. When you talk to crude quality, is this something that we can fix with spare refining capacity, like additional reforming capacity? Is this an infrastructure constraint, or is this a hard chemical constraint where refiners can't produce diesel from crude if it's too light, regardless of what you try to do?
Thank you. Let's differentiate between two time frames here. The time frame you are talking about, especially with the diesel shortages, etc., this is really short term and could be fixed. We have too many problems around the world, especially with the Russian situation and possible additional sanctions, etc. While my thesis basically is focusing more about a longer time frame than the current shortages in diesel. The idea here is let's forget about the short term and focus on the medium and long term. What is the problem with shale is the following. It's not only we can invest, and that's what was the IEA reply to me when I raised this issue years back, that all we got to do is just invest in refining and that's it. What they missed was, and that's part of the IEA problem, what they missed was this. If you look at their demand forecasts for products for the next 25 years and walk it back, it does not match the crude quality that is available, which means that those people who worked on the supply side did not talk to the people who work on the demand side. That's where the crude quality issue is. It's not on the refining side, because even if we solve the refining issue, we still have a demand issue. And especially when we go with their forecast and we see this massive increase in electric vehicles, it comes at the expense of gasoline. And if it comes at the expense of gasoline, well, most of shale production basically is gasoline. So it hits really the light crude, while everything else, like the petrochemicals and everything else there, while we need naphtha and others for petrochemicals, but we need all the other things. For example, if you look at trucking in Asia and Africa, you need the heavier crude to produce diesel and others for that. So the idea here is, it's not the refining is just part of the puzzle. It's really the demand that's going to cause these problems. Assuming that they are right about their forecast, we are going to head into a major problem where shale is not going to help us if shale production continues to grow. And we need more of the Iraqi, Saudi type crude in the future than the shale. So it's kind of a multi-layer issue. It starts with refiners and then it goes to demand. Sohaib?
So we're going to have the next person we have here is John. So go ahead, John.
Well, so first of all, props to Eleni. I also have a refining question, and thanks, Dr. Anas, for the time. Kind of building upon your previous comments, actually, I've looked at some of the pro formas on what it actually takes to upgrade some American refineries to try and treat some of this lighter, sweeter crude, and it's extremely difficult to actually manage with the current investment framework. So if we are increasingly reliant upon some of the heavier sour treatment systems, to what degree are we overlooking some of these reforms that are going on in Mexico about banning exports? To what degree do we need an expansion of, say, Arctic drilling, which is, I suppose, a lot closer to your kind of contemporary Arab Light? In your forecasting model, do we get a resolution to the sanctions on Venezuela? Or, I guess my kind of broader question is towards your framework and how you see some of this being solved on the demand side and on the production side, and how that blends to the product stages. So thanks.
Dr. Anas, are you with us?
Yes, sorry, I did not turn on the mic. Okay, if you look at the forecast that go along the IEA forecast, where we have large penetration of electric vehicles, etc., where the oil demand is going to be hit basically is going to be on the light side. So this is going to affect shale. This is going to affect Nigeria, Algeria, some of the Saudi light, etc. But the issue here is, if the shale came in, and we are talking about 7 million barrels a day, that's only for the last 10 years. We don't have it before. So theoretically, you can say that mostly it's going to hit shale, assuming that Biden and the Democrats' proposals for electric vehicles, etc., is going to take place. So we might see shale shrinking, and for that reason, I think the opposite is true, which means that the failure of those green policies will make me invest in shale, because the demand for shale is going to increase above forecasts because of that failure. Sohaib?
We got Beth. Go ahead, Beth.
Hello, I'm outside. I hope you're able to hear me. Let me know so I don't think
it's
I'm
good now, yeah. It's
okay,
good
great.
now.
Dr. Anas, always, thank you for your generosity. So appreciated. I had a thought and then a question, please. In your analysis, I don't think anybody can underestimate the long-term planning on the part of China to secure strategic resources. And I think that they will absolutely leverage that. But I want to know if you're aware whether or not analysts are factoring in any potential impact on demand were NATO and the US to be drawn further into the Russian war on Ukraine. I mean, NATO and DOD in the US would take priority in resources and Is there a potential calculus for available spare capacity were the war to expand? Just curious, and thank you.
Thank you very much. This is kind of very hard question to answer, and I'm not aware of any actual academic work being done on those scenarios. But it is very clear that those organizations will go wherever the political leadership wants them to go. And right now, even with what we see from Russia and Ukraine, it seems the attitude is still good toward green. And my issue with that is you need to balance that with energy security and economic security. If you don't, all of us are going to be in trouble. But I don't have an direct answer for your question. Thank you.
All right, we have Suleimani, I believe. Suleiman, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Anas. Hi, Sueb. Uh, Bill Browder, the backer of the Magnitsky Act, spoke in Fareed Zakria's program today, and similar articles have appeared in the past 2 weeks in Foreign Policy and NPR that the United States should use its leverage over Saudi Arabia to force it to increase the production by 3 to 4 million barrels a day. Question: does United States really have any leverage over the Saudi Arabia? Two, if the United States act along these lines, how Saudi Arabia is likely to respond? Thank you.
Thank you. I will answer with a short story. There was this guy on the internet who claims to be the god of electric vehicles, who said that all Africans should buy electric vehicles. And all I did was ask him, did he go to Africa? And he unfollowed me. And this story tells you what everyone talks about, these dreams that the U.S. will force Saudi Arabia to do this and Saudi Arabia will do this, etc. It's just exactly like this. Go to Africa and see the reality. In a sense, come to Earth and be realistic, because whatever they said, it's just out of this world. Thank you. So
we're going to go to 10 right now. 10, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Suhaib and Anas. Really much appreciate. And I just have two quick questions. One is regarding the Trans-Saharan pipeline. How feasible is that? And especially now that Europe have seen clearly that Russia is not someone that they would rely on completely for their gas needs. Do you think the Trans-Saharan pipeline is feasible, especially looking at Niger Delta, which is much of gas province, and it can supply quite a lot of gas to Europe and the rest of Africa? Do you think Trans-Saharan pipeline is actually feasible? And do you think Europe are going to look at Africa for their gas needs in the future? That's one. For two, regarding on the investment, there are proposals regarding a specialized bank for energy investments in Africa. Do you think also that is feasible? Thank you.
Thank you. I will answer the first one. The second one, I don't know anything about it. Regarding the first one, I'm glad you asked this question because this reminds me of a tweet I wrote earlier, and it's worth mentioning this. The Nigerian gas pipeline has been delayed until next year. That was announced today. At the same time, the pipeline from Basra to Aqaba in Jordan, that's an oil pipeline, has been also delayed. There are rumors that the Kazakhstan cannot bring back its production to its previous capacity before the incident, the weather incident that limited its exports. And at the same time, El Feel oil field in Libya has been closed. and the company declared force majeure. So we have all those events happening in the last 24 hours. So when we talk about volatility, just imagine we have those 4 major events happening in a very short time. Anyway, to go back to the gas pipeline, Nigeria is going to play a big role in reducing Europe's dependence on Russian gas, regardless whether via pipeline or LNG. The pipeline, of course, as you know, there are 2 routes. The route through Morocco and the route through Algeria. Each route has its own benefits and its own disadvantages. The last thing we've seen is this memorandum of understanding with Algeria that's been signed about 2-3 weeks ago. So we will see where this gas pipeline is going to go through. But it is feasible, it is important, and it is important for Algeria to export its gas. The only problem I see here is this. If you look at the Arab world basically consists of 20 plus countries, depending on how you classify some countries because of unification and the breakup, etc. There were they cooperated on many projects historically, and all projects that are intended to serve Europe has been bombed or destroyed. I mentioned the pipeline earlier in my analysis when I mentioned in 1967 embargo, or 1956, I forgot now. The pipeline was bombed. But if you look at the cooperation among all those countries on projects that serve the Arab consumers, they were very successful and well protected. I mean, who is the terrorist organization or the opposition who is going to make the consumer on the street angry at them because of this? If the consumer is European, what the heck, they do it. So my fear is with all the chaos in the Niger Delta, etc., that and Boko Haram, and that this pipeline, since the topic today is about the traditional and modern oil weapons and gas weapon, that this pipeline is going to become a target in this case. There are many technical ways of protecting it, but all comes at cost. But in terms of economics, it's a perfect pipeline. Thank you. Sohaib?
So what we're going to do is we have Cynical. Go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to Mr. Alhajji and to you, Mr. Abbas, for this panel. I have 2 quick questions. How easy it is for the countries that import Russian oil now to readjust their refineries short to medium term so they can accept other types of oil? And my second question is, why isn't Saudi Arabia fighting back against this climate change propaganda? Thank you.
Thank you. Regarding number 1, we do have other countries that have similar oil, like the Russian oil exports. So this is very easy. All we got to do is reshuffle shipments. That will increase cost little, but you don't need to reinvest and configure. In this case, this can be solved just by reshuffling shipments. For Saudi Arabia, basically, they've done several things. First of all, they became a leader in the climate change issues, where they adopted several policies where they are building wind farms, they are building solar farms, they are planning on planting millions and millions of trees, they are adopting hydrogen, etc. So they are doing a lot of things when it comes to climate change issues. And here, I would like to remind you of a story. I think this story is important in this context, that the former oil minister, Ali Naimi, encountered a CNBC journalist in the street in front of a hotel in Vienna during an OPEC meeting. That was a few years ago, probably, if I am not mistaken, in 2013. And that young woman just went on and on, attacking Noemi on how they are destroying destroying the planet, climate change, etc. And Noemi just kept walking with his entourage, and just as if she does not exist. But finally, she got on his nerve, and getting on the nerve of Noemi is hard. So you can imagine when he gets angry, what it means. And he just stopped and looked at her. He said, "Lady, you want to tell me about my climate change? Remember this: climate change passed through my country 10,000 years ago." So when you talk about the deserts in Arabia, basically, people know more about climate change than anyone else, and they are doing everything possible to protect themselves in various ways. So Saudi Arabia being a leader on this, but on the other side, they've been a leader in terms of technology on others things, like including the carbon capture, on the circular carbon economy. The problem is the other side does not believe in any of those. So whatever you do, and that's really a serious problem, which means that if we invent a technology today, will make oil and gas super clean tomorrow, they are not going to accept it. And that's sad. So,
we're going to go with Andreas. Just because we've got about 18 minutes left here. So let's go with Andreas, or you know what? Just 1 second. I'm going to go with Abe. And then after Abe, we're going to go with Andreas, Sumit, and hashtag Oil God. So we got about 18 minutes here, and we want to make the most of them. Abe, go ahead.
Yes, hi. Thank you. And also thank you again, Dr. Anas. Extraordinary. I love listening to you. I wanted to ask, first of all, make a comment and then ask a question. And part of it has been answered, but I'm going to ask, give you some context differently. I'm of the firm belief that the conflict right now that is occurring in the Ukraine is not going to end anytime soon. In fact, I believe it's going to be very protracted, and it's going to go on likely past 22, 23. It could go on for years. And my question to you is, given a scenario where something like this is protracted much longer than expected, what do you see in terms of how that impacts global energy supply, and whether or not in the short term, because I gather there's going to be considerable pain, and when I say short term, between less than 2 years, what can we expect if we have this scenario playing out in Central Europe right now? Thank you.
Thank you, Abe, and I am honored that you are here in this group. Okay, I hope that I'm trying to say this in the least number of words possible, just to save time. This is a scary scenario. We already know, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that we are heading for energy crisis, and everything you stated comes on top of that energy crisis, which means that it's going to expedite it, and it's going to make it even larger. And if you look at the announcement of the Biden administration 2 days ago about allowing drilling or selling those licenses with some conditions, it is very clear that those politicians and the Biden administration has not learned their lesson yet. And that's scary. That's scary. If we have a major crisis like this, and we are heading for even a larger crisis, and they don't realize it, and they are still putting conditions on the oil industry where it can drill, what cannot drill, and they cannot build pipelines and cannot do this, that means those politicians have not learned their lesson. And that's really the scariest thing right now. Right now, we need all energy sources. We need the support of every single energy source that we can get. And any limitations on that will make the situation worse. The scenario you mentioned basically means several things. One of them is Russia's financial situation is going to deteriorate over time, and therefore there will not be enough money to maintain their capacity. So even when they come back online in a peaceful time, we're not going to see the same amount of oil they have right now. And that makes the situation worse. That applies to gas, that applies to other minerals and other things.
So essentially, they're going to import what I would call supply constraints or supply destruction is going to be with us. There's going to be yet another paradigm that is of unintended consequence because of this, is really what you're saying. In other words, we're going to be yet again behind the curve on the supply side, given this environment moving forward.
I just wanted to just quickly say I got a message. The host is experiencing connection issues. This room may potentially end. Yusri, if we can get a better connection, that would be best.
Okay, if we get connected, we'll be back for the remaining time. And he is just not listening to us, but I don't know what the deal is. But Abe, yes, you are right. Absolutely right. Hashtag, please.
Thank you for that. Dr. Nass, it actually is a great transition from Abe's question. And I apologize, I'm on the road, and I'd be happy to report that it's not an electric vehicle. And really what Abe is pointing to is something that I think more and more people are starting to wake up to, which is that, we're going to have a problem irrespective, whether it's the politics that have done this, the Ukraine-Russia war, which has obviously escalated and of course exacerbated the supply issue of many commodities, which is going to lead to profound inflation, for obviously the near term. Has there been any thought, when you sit down and you're listening to your clients and you're listening to people that are asking you for advice on what to do, forget investing in what stocks to buy or whatever, how do you ever see this situation unwinding in the future? Because there's absolutely no way we'll ever be able to, with the political backdrop, provide the supply the world needs. So I'm curious to know, unless we start literally weaponizing our time and revamping the work week and saying, these people are working from home and there's no longer commutes to work, I really don't understand how we're ever going to be in a situation where oil prices are going to be below, I don't know, just throw out an arbitrary number, $75 WTI for the next decade. And I'd love for your comments on that.
Yes, basically, what you mentioned is a very important point for a simple reason. Remember the space we have on the 7 cycles? And that 7 cycles, basically, the main conclusion was they feed into each other, and it becomes a vicious cycle. And the only way you can break it is with a major event like a major recession. And that's exactly the case here, that you will end up with a major recession to reset everything, and we start from a lower base for demand and start growing again at a lower pace. But that's really what the case is, that we end up with a major recession, it lowers the demand, and then the growth is going to be slower than before.
So what we're going to do is that Abe was talking right before we disconnected. I'll pass it over to you, Abe. We've got about 5 more minutes left, and then we'll wrap things up here. Maybe a couple more minutes additionally, just to account for the room closure. Go ahead, Abe.
No, I think I was just stating that analysts are finally waking up to this paradigm, that this conflict is much bigger, more complex, with many impacts that, in fact, I have said this many times, this conflict will only serve to import more inflationary pressures to countries, especially the United States, that does not want the importation of more inflation because they have enough of it to deal with, let alone the whole political arena with midterms coming up, etc. So I find this rather interesting that analysts are finally waking up. And I get the question was around, and I think Dr. Anas had answered it, that I think we have to start thinking that these exogenous issues are not transitory. As a student of international relations, this is a huge deal. I don't think people have clearly understood what the hell is going on in the world, especially in the Ukraine. This is a game changer. And when you understand that it's a game changer, then you'll appreciate that the whole damn world is repositioning, is reshifting in real time as you see it. And as a result, the consequences to energy security, the weaponization of energy, all of these things are going to have to be quantified. And that's why I asked the question. Within the next 24 months, you're going to see very profound changes, because I don't see the conflict changing or moving. And as a result, and Dr. Anas did answer my question on the, in terms of what happens in the process as you get deterioration in Russia. You're also going to get deterioration in supply. And when you want it at some more favorable time, it's not going to come back the way that you want it. And as a result, it lends itself into what I would call even more pressure and multi-year pressures moving forward. And at the same time, you're still going to have profound inflationary impacts to the entire value chain of energy, from extracting to the refining process to delivering, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't something that just magically disappears just because a conflict is coming to some sort of a close, which, by the way, I don't see it happening anytime soon. So that was my point, and Dr. Anas was pretty much confirmed and answered my question as I believed it to be. Thank you.
Well said, Abe. All my hope right now is not to have any political crisis in any country that produces coffee.
I hope not either. I'm addicted to it. Thank you.
And Andreas, go ahead, Andreas. We can keep within 45 seconds here for the duration.
Very quick. Thanks, Dr. Nass. But my question is, okay, supply demand. Let's keep it simple. What about the floating armada out there? Have they been draining like that resource? And the strategic reserves. Yeah, that makes the news. So, do they have to make up for this? Is this going to make governments drill more because they're stuck? And they don't have time. And that's it. I'll keep it quick.
I personally think that the SPR will not be rebuilt to the same way it was, or even near it. I think if they are going to refill, it will be a very small amount. So those who are capitalizing on refilling it, they should reconsider. At the same time, I think whatever legal conditions that can be changed easily. There is one point, kind of misunderstood point, that the requirement by the IEA is 90 days of net imports. And we are a net exporter right now, which means that from IEA point of view, we can just drain that to the minimum possible, technically, drain the SPR. Simply because we are a net exporter, we are not a net importer. And by the definition of the IEA, oil is everything, not only crude. And if everything, we are a net exporter, and therefore we don't need any of the SPR based on the IEA requirement. Sohaib?
So we have Sumit, and then after that we have Raed. Sumit, go ahead. 45 seconds or less, Sumit, preferably 30. Go ahead, Sumit.
Okay. Thanks, Sohaib. Good evening to you, Doctor. It is absolutely a pleasure to hear you. Sir, I'll be very quick about it. So, sir, I am a very keen follower of the Indian oil and gas space. And, sir, how do you basically see India should take up this, energy challenge? Because India is an 85% importer of oil. And with oil prices, being as high as they are, and with Indian government, keeping excise duty very high, the pump prices are only going higher. So do you think that at some point of time, the Indian government would have to start cutting the excise duty? Or how do you see that India should, see the energy landscape from here?
Oh man, I've already been attacked by a large number of people from India 2 days ago for just listing India in one list that I mentioned, and just listing it among 25 countries. So I don't know what to say right now because I have no time even to block them. The issues with India energy system are too many. It's a very large country, and it's a growing country like crazy. And if we talk about even growth 30 years from now, it will continue to grow. The problem is you have contradicting policies, whether on local levels or on federal level. At the same time, you have nationalistic government that look at things from a nationalistic point of view, which, when it comes to energy security, does not make sense. Uh, Energy security and nationalism do not work together. So something got to give. At the same time, we already have seen 2 days ago a cyber attack on Oil India. This is kind of really important news because we really want to figure out whether this was political or not. If it is political, it's a serious problem and it will add to India's problems. If it's not political, then just one event and there was a soft target for the hackers and they did what they did. But seriously, if it is political and somehow I feel that there could be some politics involved in it, looking always for the cheapest possible is not good if you are looking for security. Security has a price, and it does not come cheap. So it's very hard to put all those problems together and solve them. But it is very clear to me that when it comes to energy security, the principles are well known and they should follow them and forget about those some of the nationalistic media hype that people talk about. Sohaib?
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, we've got oil up to 107 here as the markets open up. Jared Hall, go ahead.
Thank you, Sohaib. The same space, always a
Yeah.
excellent dialogue as always.
No worries, you cut out.
Can you hear me, Sohaib? Hello?
Yeah,
okay.
You just cut out, but you're good now.
Thank you. Dr. Anas, Abe, absolute pleasure as always. Real quick, you and Abe alluded to some trouble on the horizon here, and we talked some recessionary events coming up on the horizon, if we're not on the horizon already. Dr. Anas, can you give me your specific analysis in terms of how resilient you think oil will be if and when, if not we already are in this recessionary time that's coming? I know, Abe, you had spoke about it very, very specifically as well, too. But how resilient do you feel oil is going to be in some turbulent times ahead with recession, especially when demand fears creep in and whatnot? So if you can provide some specifics, that would be excellent.
I think you have to pay for that. Okay, here is the point. Oil is going to be more resilient than others because OPEC agreement is still valid and it will continue. We already seen a meeting between MBS, or at least some conversation between MBS and Putin yesterday. They asserted their stand toward cooperation on OPEC Plus. We've seen what they've done when oil prices declined. We've seen what OPEC did. Again, this is not OPEC Plus. What OPEC did in the midst of the recession in 2009, they were able to cut production, raise prices. In fact, they were able to double prices in the midst of the recession. So in terms of resiliency, of course, you cannot have resiliency at the upper level of the band or the higher end of prices. Resiliency means that there is a floor, and that floor is relatively high. So my expectation is that if we have a recession where prices just decline to $35, we will see OPEC Plus reacting immediately, and prices will go back above 60 once that agreement is in effect.
All right, folks. We'll go about maybe 4 minutes here, and then we're going to be done. Raed, go ahead. And then you won't might not even less than 4 minutes here. You're probably the last question today. Raed, go ahead.
Thank you, Suhaib. Hello, Dr. Anas. I'll be very quick. There is an opinion floating around that I'd like you to verify, and it goes as follows. That Russia is dependent on Western companies that service oil fields, like the Schlumberger and others, and that these companies they have self-embargoed themselves on any future projects, and that this will affect the Russian ability to develop new oil fields in the future, especially that the new oil fields in Russia further north are harder to develop. How true is that? And thank you.
I am glad. I'm glad you mentioned this in specific words, because I was watching that, and the way you described it is absolutely correct. Where those service companies did not leave Russia, and they did not leave any of the current projects or any of the contracts. They are talking about literally new contracts for future projects. So Russian oil is safe for the short term and medium term without any problems. The issue is, what about the long term? Because you need to compensate for production, you want to compensate for decline rates, and what will happen by then. That is an issue depending on. Eb mentioned this is going to last for several years. He's talking about the war. If that's the case, then we might see some reduction in Russia's oil production, and this is going to affect all the balances of the future as a result. However, if this conflict is limited in terms of time, and then we have those companies recommitting their investment for the future, then we have no problem. But what we are going to see instead is that those companies and the super majors and some national oil companies, including the Chinese, they are going to go some new frontiers. I mean, this investment is not going to stop. Whatever they want to investment, whatever work they do. I mean, Schlumberger and Halliburton, they cannot just minimize themselves and keep minimizing forever until their value just disappears. So what they are going to do is they will go to other frontiers, and we might see more offshore, and probably some new countries, especially in Africa. I mean, Somalia was mentioned at the beginning of the space today. One of them is Somalia. So the idea here is, yes, if this war lasts for several years and those companies cannot invest, they will go somewhere else. Suhaib?
Perfect. What we're going to do is we're going to wrap up this room here real quick. I just wanted to end it with just a question here of my own before I make an announcement. So right now we're just looking at an article here. It says big oil is sowing the seeds for a super spike in crude prices above $150, Bernstein warns. Now, this is what's unique about this. It's published Friday, July 6th, 2018. Well, clearly we know what has taken place since. Would you be able to talk real quick as to, where are we at now relative to 2018? We're in 2022. It's been 4 years since this headline, and why this time may actually be different?
Without mentioning names, there were several consulting houses that predicted we will have $100 oil by the fourth quarter of 2018. For those who are interested, they can go back to my timeline around that time and see where I stood on this, because I was literally saying no way, and luckily I was right. So the situation in 2018 is completely different from now. Now we have a political situation where things could go wrong all the way, or if the war stops tomorrow, things will go the other way. When you have political situation we don't know when this war is going to end and what the impact, and whether we are going to have additional sanctions, whether some fringe group is going to do some damage. I'm surprised that Russians until today they have not resorted to cyber attacks on a massive scale in Europe and the United States. And the question is why? So if we go that route, everything could go wrong. In this case, we already seen the Colonial Pipeline incident in May 2021, and we lost over 5 million barrels a day of products as a result. And they have to pay them Bitcoin with the help of the U.S. government. I know that they got involved because they want to follow them and retrieve some of the money, but still, with the help of the U.S. government, that means they were not able to solve the problem technically, and they have to pay them, and that's really a serious issue. If this happened in the United States, imagine this happening in some of the third world countries where they don't have the capabilities even to retrieve or do anything.
So as we wrap up the event here for today, I just wanted to once again draw everybody's attention to the bulletin I've shared up top. Just to, we've spent Dr. Anas has spent almost going on to 2 hours and 15 minutes here with us, freely giving us time, sharing content, educating us to the market. If anyone's wanted to take a minute to show any appreciation, there's a charity up top that Dr. Anas is involved with. Dr. Anas, would you be able to talk about what the charity is and what that's all about before we wrap up here? Dr. Anas, you're not. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. This is a medical clinic in the mountains of Lebanon that serves a big or a massive Syrian refugee camp. It's all in tents, by the way. They've been living in tents for a very long time. And with the deterioration of the economy of Lebanon, many middle-class families basically in Lebanon are not able even to afford their lifestyle. So this clinic serves Lebanese and Syrians free of charge. And they have some amazing stories. I posted some stories on my Twitter account. They have an eye clinic, basically. And one of the stories that really kind of shook me to my core, that there was this young boy who had cataracts since he was in the womb. So he never seen his family. He never seen his mother. He never seen anything around him. And about 1 year old, they took him to this clinic. And with $100 only, just with $100, they were able to retrieve his sight, and he saw his mother for the first time. I put another story. This is a young girl, and you can see the pictures on in my timeline. She had those what's known as crushed eyes, and they brought her to the clinic, and with again almost $150. Look at the picture of the girl. Her parents are so happy that they cannot, and they live in a tent, by the way. They were the happiest people in the world. So the idea here is we are changing lives of people. So those people who got treated, it's a completely life change, at the same time making everyone happy. And this is one purpose of life, is making people happy. So please help. And all the information and the link is on
the Nest.
on my Twitter account.
I also posted it on the Nest. So on this space up top, it's right there. So without further ado, we want to just to wrap this up. Dr. Anas, thank you. This is going on to the third session, and we really appreciate all of these sessions. They're very informative for us. Without further ado, Dr. Anas, maybe closing comments before we wrap up, and we'll call it a day here.
Yes, the final comment I have is the fact that weaponizing climate change is just shifting the dependence of resources from certain resources and from certain countries to other resources and other countries. And what's funny about this is most of the countries that have oil and gas are friendly to the United States, friendly to Europe, while the countries that control the green resources, if you want to call them that way, may not be, especially that processing those resources is mostly done in China. So weaponizing climate change is just shifting the resources and shifting the countries, but does not change anything in the final analysis. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. Stay tuned for the next spaces. And without further ado, we make our goodbyes. Thank you, Altaqa, for efforts in hosting this space. And do keep your eyes open for the recording of this space. Will be on YouTube. Will be shared by Altaqa, which will be then again retweeted by Dr. Anas.
Sohaib, just one comment here. Thank you, Muhammad in Cairo from Attaqa. Please, if you see anything in Arabic that I tweet, do not forget to use that translate button, because Attaqa is the only media outlet that focuses on energy in Arabic, and they produce a lot of material, a lot of news, a lot of reports, and whatever I write sometimes in Arabic. So use that translate button. Thank you, Sohaib, very much. You are just a great moderator. Thank you.
Absolutely, anytime. And without further ado, take care, everybody. We'll see you guys in future spaces. All the best.